October of 2019, there was we could see a slowing of global growth. There was what's called a repurchase agreement crisis between the Fed and the banks. It's overnight money lent between banks and institutions and central banks. And this lending spiked up all of a sudden in September, October of 2019. So we knew something was coming. We call it the plumbing of the system. The overnight lending is the guts of the system upon which all the leverage is built. And then, curiously enough, COVID came along right on time. And then the Fed had cover or an excuse, and the other central banks had cover and an excuse to go on unprecedented monetary printing binges. The Fed increased the money supply 65% in 2020. That's the largest percent increase in the monetary system ever in the history of the Fed. And it was done under the guise of emergency measures. The Fed then was able to also gave itself, along with some approval from Congress, measures to buy corporate credit, because that was the problem in the fall of 2019. Corporate credit markets were becoming unhinged. So they were able to buy credit, and they were able to stabilize the system for a couple more years. Well, that was 2020. Today's 2022. And what you see going on now are financial markets becoming unhinged, credit markets becoming unhinged, currency markets becoming unhinged. And the actual reason why is we're at the end of the system and they can no longer control it. And we do have inflation, but the inflation, I'm here to tell you, is not monetary inflation. It's supply chain inflation. It's because of all the mistakes we made during COVID, all the intentional energy policy by the Biden administration and the European Union governments, and also the Ukraine war. So the inflation we're seeing is due to those policies. In addition, some things I'm going to talk about in a little bit in terms of disability from the COVID vaccines, which is causing a labor shortage. So what we're seeing is inflation, but it's not monetary inflation. It's supply side inflation. And the Fed is now undertaking what we call an interest rate hike cycle. They actually shouldn't be doing that. And that's because the dollar against all other currencies is rising. And what you need to know about that is in every commodity cycle, the dollar usually goes down when commodities go up, because that's what inflation is. It's too many dollars chasing too few goods. Well, this time, this is the first commodity cycle we've had where the dollar and the commodity index, which is known as the CRB, has gone up 211%. By the way, that's the largest percent increase ever in a commodity cycle advance. It's been swift and fast and brutal. I was very suspicious of the vaccines because I only knew two things at the time that they were introduced. One, that typical vaccine safety measures, it takes 7 to 10 years to vet all the safety data before you usually get approval. The approval was so swift, I was very suspect. And also Operation Warp Speed alarmed me, because anything that's done at Operation Warp Speed suggests to me that safety corners are cut, normal protocols are ignored. I have a whistleblower, Brooke Jackson, that I've talked to. She has talked about the unblinding of her patients. So we saw fraud from her, and more fraud is coming out as more is revealed. Then the FDA in the fall of 2021 took the unprecedented step of suggesting that those who wanted to see the clinical trial data, because it was asked for by a group of doctors, that data could not be seen for 75 years. So
could I interject just for a minute to
Sure.
kind of summarize what you're attempting to bring out and have spoken of before? So it's my understanding that what you're saying is that the pandemic was in service to distract from the financial collapse that is in front of us.
Correct. And lots of people ask me, was it planned, or it doesn't matter. Well, all we need to prove right now, it's being used as an excuse to provide cover.
So back to the clinical trials, because this is important. So if it was in service of the support of distracting from the financial collapse, then there is a rationale or a understanding of why then would there be fraud related to the vaccines. So continue with what you were saying about the
Correct. So,
fraudulent.
right. So the fraud, it could have been intentional or mistaken, meaning that the agenda is this. They need to, because of the financial collapse, you need to have a system of control to prevent people from rioting and traveling and getting uppity about the fact that their pensions and a lot of what they viewed as the world as they knew it is now gone. So the vaccines, in my belief, were rushed to provide a system of control, meaning vaccine passports, restriction of travel. And so you could make the case that the fraud was intentional or unintentional, but it was the end result because the system wanted to have vaccine passports and control over the population and using the virus as an excuse to shut down certain activities like protests, gatherings, keep people isolated during a financial crisis. And they're in fear about a virus rather than a fear that the system's collapsing because of the politicians and the central bankers. If you're a central banker and a politician, would you want to admit that the system that you've created the last 12 years is imploding? Would you want to take the rap for that? No, you would not. And so the incentives to prevent that from coming to light were there. And the incentives to use COVID as a convenient excuse to implement controls and print money were there. So they took, we'll find out eventually whether this was a planned event or an excuse. We don't need to know that right now. All we need to know is they took advantage of the crisis to divert attention from the financial collapse and to implement control systems under the guise of medical help for our own benefit. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense because the proof for me, one of the things I saw early on was on April 5th of 2020, a Federal Reserve president, James Bullard, he's the president of the St. Louis Federal Reserve. He got on Face the Nation. And this is only a month after the lockdowns. And he was asked the question, well, how do we turn the economy back on? People will be scared. They won't want to shop. They won't want to go anywhere. They won't want to go to work. And he said, well, due to technology, we have the ability now to test people and we can provide immunity badges and they can get tested every couple of weeks. And then the segment ended and then the host said, well, when we come back, we'll talk about the surveillance technologies available now to monitor that. So this was floated as an idea in April of 2020. If you roll forward into the summer of 2020, I was and others were talking about the coming vaccine passports. We were called conspiracy theorists. Well, sure enough, that became a real thing. The vaccines also were going to make people a lot of money. Just to give you an idea, the amount of money that Pfizer stood to make. It doesn't look like they're going to make that right now because the vaccine program, it's got problems, as we know. The idea was to vaccinate the globe. And if Pfizer got 50% of the market share, which I think is reasonable to assume, and the goal, what they wanted to do was to get us on quarterly boosters. So I did the simple math, and that would have annually give Pfizer, if they got 50% of, I assumed 5 billion humans would get vaccinated, that would give them revenues of 350 billion. Their revenue before COVID was 40 billion. Think about that, 40 billion to 350 billion. So if you don't think there was enough incentive for them to cut corners, get anything they wanted through and not care about the safety results, I can tell you, you're naive. And if you don't think there was enough money to bribe politicians in countries, to bribe politicians in the US, you're naive. The money and the prize was so big. This is what, and they have a history and a track record of doing this. They were convicted in the early 2000s of bribing doctors to push pharmaceutical sales. They had the biggest fine ever. So this is part of their corporate policy as far as I'm concerned. I remember driving around Maui and hearing ads before it was actually approved by the FDA. It was authorized. They didn't get approval till later in the fall of 2021. But during the early months of the vaccination program, on the radio here, they were saying, get your vaccine. It's approved by the FDA. So there was fraud. There was fraudulent advertising. And then let's go back to the two frauds I talked about before. Corporate fraud. It was a new paradigm. Okay, real estate fraud. Home prices never go down. This fraud, safe and effective. So every fraud has a catchphrase to make people feel good. And this catchphrase was safe and effective. I have a lot of proof that shows not only is it not safe, it's killed a large number of our countrymen, and it continues to injure many, many people, which will have effects globally and in the U.S. for, I think, decades to come. This is a big problem. So that's kind of the summary of the financial aspects. Why the prize was so big, how you could see that so many institutions would sign up for this because money was to be made. You don't need to imagine a bunch of old fat white men in the back room laughing, evilly smoking cigars. Money incentivizes people to do things against, and they may not even know, they just wanted to make money. And so they went along with it. And not everybody saw the big picture. So this is, the other thing that came to light was this year we found out that the mainstream media received over $1 billion in money from the US government to push the vaccines and not promote counter narratives or anything negative about the vaccines.
Yes, and I knew of someone personally who was hired by a gigantic PR firm in 2020 before it even began, to promote whatever it is that was the agenda of control through mass media. So it millions of dollars was spent on this PR firm before it was even announced that there was a pandemic. So it's very nefarious.